I think philosophy really is something special. A society in which people didn't think deeply about how they ought to live would be really an impoverished society.
Well, I wanted to start really practically with you. Maybe you could help me with an ethical dilemma or debate I'm having with my wife. I would like to donate one of my kidneys, as you talk about in the book, and my wife is quite concerned. She thinks that I should save them in case one of our children need them. How do you solve this?
If you're prepared to donate your kidneys and your wife is not going to divorce you because you do it, I think you should go ahead with it. I think it's a wonderful thing to do. Now, in saying that, I should say that I still have 2 kidneys, so I'm really in no position to tell your wife that she's wrong. But donating a kidney does make a huge difference to somebody who needs a kidney, possibly save their life, certainly make the quality of life vastly better. And the chances that you will need your kidney either for one of your children or for yourself are extremely small.
It does strike me that if you do something so generous, I know karma isn't actually real, but I would like to think that if you put something like that out into the world, the chances of you dying in desperate need of a kidney and nobody coming to your rescue strikes me as pretty slim, and also perhaps not a world you'd want to continue to live in either.
Yeah, well, certainly pretty slim. That's definitely true. It would be a terrible, ironic fate if you then did need a kidney for yourself. If you're one kidney, it's really unlikely. Very few diseases would strike only one kidney, so generally that's not the issue. But I suppose theoretically, at least, you could get hit by a car that just destroyed the kidney on the side that you had left. What are the odds of that? Not very great.
So why haven't you done it? You do seem like an exceedingly generous person and a person who lives the philosophy that you talk about. What's held you back from doing it?
Well, one thing is when I first heard about altruistic kidney donation, when it became accepted, which is not that long ago, I was already in my 60s, and some people suggested that my kidneys were getting a little bit old to donate. But I'm not sure. Maybe that was a kind of a rationalization. Maybe I'm just a coward when it comes to undergoing surgery, which I do find it a lot easier to give a substantial part of my income to people who need it than I do to give one of my bodily organs.
Well, my wife's other argument was we've both already checked the organ donor box on our driver's license, so we've effectively already made the donation. We're just holding it in trust until we don't need it anymore.
Yes, except that the chances are you're going to get older, like me, or even older before you die, hopefully, and by which time your kidney may not be very much good. Those check boxes are really useful should you be in a accident and be brain dead or something like that. That's good, but unless you're going to spend a lot of time riding a motorcycle without a helmet, you're probably not going to end up like that.
When I wrote The Daily Stoic 8 years ago, I had this crazy idea that I would just keep it going. The book was 366 meditations, but I'd write one more every single day and I'd give it away for free as an email. I thought maybe a few people would sign up. Couldn't have even comprehended a future in which 750,000 people would get this email every single day, and would for almost a decade. If you want to get the email, if you want to be part of a community that is the largest group of Stoics ever assembled in human history, I'd love for you to join us. You can sign up and get the email totally for free. No spam. You can unsubscribe whenever you want at dailystoic.com/email. Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I found the book very fascinating. I read obviously I was familiar with your work, and then I read this 10-year anniversary edition. And you start off the book, you say something kind of interesting that I wanted to get some clarity on from you. You're saying at the beginning of the book, basically, you're going to be asking people to be far more generous than they currently are. You're going to ask developed nations to be more generous than they currently are. And yet you also say that this version of the book entails you scaling back to a certain degree what you expect people to give or what you think our obligations are. So talk to me about that tension in the evolution of your philosophy.
Right. So my thinking on this goes back not just to the first edition of the book, The Life You Can Save, but to an article I wrote in 1972 called Famine, Affluence and Morality. And in that article, obviously I was quite young then, in that article, I argued that really the only ultimate limit of how much we should give is the point at which if we gave more, we would be harming ourselves more than we would be benefiting the person we were helping. And given the discrepancies between affluence in developed countries and people in extreme poverty in low income countries, that's a very demanding standard. Really, you have to impoverish yourself to a pretty extreme level. And although there's a sense in which, ultimately, if you say what's the best thing to do, that might be the best thing to do. But the effect of telling people that morality is that demanding is actually a big downer, right? I think they're less likely then to say, okay, I'm going to do this. They're more likely to say, wow, if morality is that demanding, too bad for morality. I'm just not going to take any notice of it. So my scaling back is kind of pragmatic. It's designed to produce the best consequences. And I think producing the best consequences don't come from asking people to make things that really they would inevitably see as a huge sacrifice, but rather from asking something less from them and convincing them that this is not really a sacrifice at all, but that this is something that, yes, they'll, in terms of money, they'll be a little less well off, but in terms of satisfaction, purpose in life, fulfillment, they'll actually be better off.
Yeah, it strikes me as a trade-off between appealing to the handfuls of Gandhis and Jesuses and saintly figures out in the world who would hear this call and cut everything to the bone, which might cumulatively add up to, a small amount of difference, or appealing to a large number of people to give slightly more than they might be inclined to give, and cumulatively end up with a lot more aid or help or raw material, and having to strike that balance is a difficult one.
Yes, I think you put that very well. I think it is an attempt to try to persuade people to give what will amount to the largest benefits for people in need. And I have become convinced that having a less demanding target, but getting more people to donate, that will end up adding up to a greater sum.
That is, I think, the tension in a lot of philosophy, right? Because it's not that philosophy is naive, but there is a kind of a purity or an idealism in a lot of philosophical thinking, particularly when it gets to morality. But you use the word pragmatism there also. For this philosophy to be brought into the world effectively, that is, a certain amount of pragmatism is required. And yet, if all you're focused on is pragmatism, you probably end up with simply maintaining the status quo.
Yes, that's right, and it's very relevant in politics too. And if you move from philosophy to politics, you have to think about the effects of what you're advocating, and if the effects are going to be really negative, then you don't want to advocate that as a politician. You're not going to get anywhere. You're going to maybe damage the party that you're associated with and maybe lose a lot more besides. So I think it is, similarly when a philosopher gets involved in practical ethics and talking about actual decisions people make, you do have to think about what effect am I going to have? And is that overall effect going to be better or worse if I have a pure idealistic demand rather than one that is realistic for the circumstances you're in?
It's interesting. The philosophy that I write and think a lot about, which is Stoicism, so ancient Greece and ancient Rome, philosophy and politics were inextricably linked. They were one and the same. The philosophers were often politicians. The politicians would consult philosophers. With the exception of your work and a handful of other philosophers, it does feel like in the modern world, the two worlds could not be further apart and have really less influence on each other.
To some extent, that's true, but not entirely. I think I'm not the only one. If you think about people who are actually doing political philosophy, say John Rawls would be an example.
Sure. And not so recent, though.
Not so recent, I guess. No, but still certainly within my lifetime. Maybe not yours. I think his ideas had an influence on American politics anyway. So I think there is still a connection, but it's certainly, you're quite right, it's not the same as it was in ancient Greece or Rome. Although, the philosophers didn't always do too well, did they? Look at Seneca's tutoring of Nero, for example. Didn't turn out great.
Well, I think about that all the time because either he was a martyr-like figure saving us from a much worse outcome, or he was a complete and utter hypocrite who debased his philosophy. And depending on what is happening in the news and what side of the bed I woke up on, I can make the argument in either direction.
Right. Yes. I don't know. I can't comment on that, but I think it does show that it's hard for philosophy to have an impact on the real world. I mean, it does, but it doesn't always have it exactly in the direction that you want it to have.
Yeah, I mean, there was an observation, I think it was from Cicero, was talking about Cato, and he said, Cato acted as if he lived in Plato's Republic instead of in the dregs of Romulus. And his point was that Cato went through the world, thinking about these sort of big moral questions, simply on their face, not about what was possible or impossible. He's thinking about them, what's right and wrong, not what's easy or what's hard. And this was admirable and made him, a cut above most of the pragmatic philosophers of his time. And yet he was also pretty ineffectual, pretty unable to compromise, pretty much stood alone apart from everyone else because, everyone else understood that they weren't living in Plato's Republic.
Right. And you could probably take that to current United States politics, and you could say some of those on the liberal wing of the Democrats are in a somewhat similar position to Cato. Maybe they think they're living in certainly some more ideal society, whether they're living in a country that is, the dregs of Trump's presidency, maybe.
Well, I'll give you another Stoic concept that I think ties quite beautifully with your work, and I've been thinking about a lot. So I'm in the middle of now a series on the cardinal virtues. So I just did courage. I wrote about discipline. Now I'm writing about justice, which is why I was so excited to read this book, yours. But are you familiar with Hierocles' circles of concern?
Very loosely, only circles of concern, yes. But you want this scholarship? No, you better give me.
Well, I'll summarize it for the listener, but it's this idea that we come into the world self-interested. We care about our own immediate survival, and then our circle expands a little bit. We care about our family. We care about people that look like us, people that look near us. But there are these concentric rings that get bigger and bigger, and eventually include not just people we'll never meet, but animals and everything that's ever lived. And he basically argued, and this I think surprises people because they think of Stoicism as such an individualistic philosophy. He said the work of philosophy was to try to pull these outer rings towards the center, to care about more people and more things as you go through life. And when I read your work on veganism, on effective altruism, it strikes me, and long-termism, all of the stuff that's come out of your thinking, it strikes me that that's the work that you're doing, trying to help people bring these outer concerns closer and closer to home, and to have more impact on those seemingly far away or impossibly
complex or difficult global issues.
Right. You're absolutely right that that's what I'm doing. And in fact, I wrote a book in the 80s, which got reissued more recently, called The Expanding Circle, which talks about exactly that. But I traced that to W.E.H. Lecky, the historian of Rome. He wrote a wonderful book called The History of European Morals from Augustus to Charlemagne, I think the subtitle is. And he talks about that expanding circle. And that's where I got it from. And I was not aware that it came out of a Stoic philosophy. So that's something I've learned. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think particularly with regards to animals, the idea that it's not just, hey, you should care about somebody who lives in a country that's not yours, but you should also care about an animal that can't even tell you that they're suffering or are in pain. Yes,
I think that's quite right. And I've also been engaged in a dialogue with a Buddhist philosopher called Shi Chao Wei, and she argues that you can get there through Buddhist meditation. That you start by thinking about somebody that you love who's close to you, and you imagine them suffering, and you feel compassion for them then suffering, and then you transfer that to somebody who's a little further from you, and you feel the same empathy and compassion. And then you keep going outwards. And so then you also can end up with compassion for non-human animals, for example.
Now, one of the ways I do that is I think about how I feel about my kids and what they mean to me. And then I try to think about someone that I've never met or someone even that I dislike or that has done something horrible. And I try to think about how they think about their kids. And then I try to expand that further. And I think, how does this lioness think about their kids? Or how does the last living rhino think about its offspring or, its kin? And when you do that, I think you very quickly pick up on some idea of kinship or sameness between all living beings. And it makes it harder to be so indifferent to the fate of that other person or thing, because as the Stoics would say, you realize that they have a nature not unlike your own.
Yeah, that sounds a very similar sort of thing to what Chao Wei was talking about.
Do you have children?
I do. I have 3 children, and now I have 4 grandchildren as well.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, one of the things you do talk about in the book is this struggle. Speaking of the circles of concern, we obviously all care a lot about our kids, and you talk about certain activists who are spending time in Africa or wherever. And they think about just the comforts and the things they would do for their children, and then the sort of indifference to the suffering of these other children. How do you think about that in your life? Like, how do you think about, obviously as a parent, you have this obligation, a specific obligation to these people, but I guess you would argue that doesn't exempt you from an obligation to these other people just because you're not biologically related to them.
Yeah, certainly not. And people often say, well, should I give exactly the same weight to a stranger's child as I would to my own? And I think it's totally understandable that if you had to choose between saving your child and saving a child of a stranger, you would choose your own child. But on the other hand, the extent to which we give preference to our own children really reaches, I think, quite grotesque levels in modern society, where we think that we have to give our child all of the latest toys, whatever they might be, expensive electronic, Xboxes or whatever, and we don't do anything for the children of strangers. And I think it would be quite reasonable to say to your child, and they would understand, at least once they got to a certain age, that look, you're not getting this even though your friends have it, because do you know there are children who don't get enough to eat, or who, when they get sick, they can't go to the doctor because their parents can't afford it, can't even have a book to read. So I think we ought to be scaling back the preference for our own without entirely abolishing it.
Yeah, I forget where I got this, but it definitely shaped me when I heard it. They were saying that, not that long ago, if you heard someone say, hey, I think we should put in a pool for the kids, they meant we should put in a community center that has a pool, right? And now when you hear people say we should put in a pool for the kids, they mean in their backyard. And so it's not just, like, do you care about these suffering children far away? But it does seem like, especially in America, the sort of nuclear family and the protection and the advancement of the interests of a very small amount of people is the norm, even more than just thinking about people who live near you or people that live in your town or people that, are part of your community or state or even country. We just have a very, very selfish, self-absorbed notion of what is ours.
That's right. And it's significant that it's the fact that people can have a pool in their backyard, that those things exist now, which didn't always exist. That
Sure.
means that they don't have to get together with members of their community and say, hey, wouldn't it be great if our kids could go into a pool when it's hot? So let's work for the community, find some land, raise some money, produce a pool. And then you're doing that together as a community enterprise, and also your kids are more likely to be meeting other kids in that area. So it is a loss of community that we can do all of these things just within the nuclear family.
It's kind of weird too. I think philosophically you said, like, should you think about your kids exactly the same as other kids? And no one's in real life ever really asking you that question, right? Like, I think philosophy sometimes gets caught up with these impossible questions that kind of exempt us from having to make, real choices in the real world. Like, I think about the trolley problem. Obviously, it's an interesting thought exercise, but really, you're never going to be there. It's not going to happen to you where you're like, am I throwing the switch this way to kill these people or that people? But actually, on a daily basis, you are asked, do you want to make this product in America, or do you want to make it in a Chinese factory where children are having to work there, or the environmental conditions are terrible, or blah, blah, blah. And, no one's going to die either way, but one's going to be more expensive than the other. So what do you choose, right? Like, it strikes me that the moral choices that we actually face as human beings are less stark, but also less impossible. And maybe we get caught up in these sort of abstract moral questions instead of having to think about the more practical, tangible, ethical quandaries that modern life presents us.
Yeah, philosophers do spend a lot of time talking about hypotheticals, and they're interesting as thought experiments. I think they help to clarify people's ideas and to test what they really think about certain situations. I think some of the work helps us to understand where our moral intuitions come from. Josh Green, who's a professor of psychology at Harvard, but started off as a graduate student in philosophy here at Princeton, has done some interesting psychology work on the trolley problem, which, as I say, shows something about, I think, our evolved responses to hands-on violence that's playing a role there. But in terms of trying to work out what we ought to do in our real life, we're not in those artificial situations where you can say, well, that this is going to happen if you do A, and that that's going to happen if you do B, and that's all you know. So we do need to think about real life differently.
Right. It's like you're not asked, should you value this kid over that kid, but you are asked, will you send your kid to private school or public school? Right.
Yeah.
And one of those has community consequences and kind of the other doesn't, but neither choice is totally free. And we sort of make those unthinkingly or without much regard to the philosophical or moral consequences of that decision, even though it's actually the sort of quandary, the moral quandary that life has put us in.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you raise that, because that is an important example. It is a decision people make, and they tend to make it simply on the basis of what they think will be best for their child, and they may not even be right about that. But you're right; it has far more ramifications. So it has ramifications for the community in terms of if, particularly, educated people send their children to private schools, then there's less support for the public schools. They have a different student body, and then it becomes a vicious spiral, right? Because then people say, well, I'm not going to send my child there because the only people there are people who don't have educated parents and, not going to be that academically gifted. So I don't want my children to be there. But if you have a strong public school in your area where everybody attends, it does a lot for the community. It maintains the level of the school. It helps the disadvantaged people in the community who get to go to the same school as more advantaged people. Plus, you're going to save a lot of money. And then you can ask yourself, what can I do with that money? And that's where we get back to helping people in extreme poverty in low-income countries.
How did you, not to pry into your personal life, but how did you make that decision with your own children? As my kids are very young, so I'm thinking about this myself now.
Right. We send all of our children to public schools. And interestingly, our children have carried that on. So all of our grandchildren are going to public schools as well. Now, I should say, we brought up our children in Melbourne, Australia, and the grandchildren are still there. Nobody is sending their kids to a school where there's a serious fear that there'll be violence done to them. So it's maybe easier than it is for some people in some neighborhoods.
Sure.
Elsewhere. That's true. And I can't say what I would have done if in that situation, if I thought the public schools were really very rough and even dangerous places. But if you have a public school that is not that bad, and especially if you get together and talk to some of your friends about it with kids of the same age, and you send your kids to the same public school, you can have a real impact on the level of schooling in that community.
No, that's very beautifully put. But I had another specific question for you that I thought was quite interesting in the book. You talked about, as you're talking about effective altruism, you make this comparison. You go, this is what it costs to raise a seeing eye dog. It's like $50,000. And then here's what it costs to cure someone of blindness in, the developing world. It's like $7 or something like that, which it totally makes sense. It's a very compelling, example. It's like, do you want to make one person's life a little bit better, or do you want to radically transform hundreds or thousands of people's lives for the same cost? But I assume we're all on the same page that a blind person should have a seeing eye dog if it would be helpful to them. How does, again, when we get in these questions, it can be so simple to go yes, you pick one over the other, but who pays for the seeing eye dog, right? How does that happen in your sort of worldview? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, we don't have unlimited resources, and I think we ought to prioritize the resources where they will do the most good. So if there is somebody who is blind, my priority would be for them to see again before somebody who is blind but can't be helped to see again, gets a seeing eye dog.
Sure.
And that would be true even if it cost the same to help somebody see and to help somebody get a seeing eye dog.
Sure.
But when, as you say, it costs hundreds of times less, possibly even thousands, but I'm not going to go that far. Let's just say hundreds.
Sure.
Hundreds of times less to restore sight in somebody in a low-income country who has cataracts and can't see, or to prevent people becoming blind from trachoma, say, which is a common preventable cause of blindness in low-income countries, then I think that's what you should do. And you should only be donating to seeing eye dog societies when there's nobody left who you can help to see for the same cost as providing a seeing eye dog.
Yeah, that's so tough, I guess. We would like to live in a world where everyone can get what they need.
It's very easy for people to say, let's do both. Actually, I had there was a lecture at Princeton that I went to just a week or two ago, at which somebody was talking about more funding for the arts. Saying it's a bad thing that our community doesn't do more funding for the arts. So I said, well, this is a community in which there are some people who have no health coverage. Unlike other affluent countries, the United States does not provide universal health coverage. The United States also provides a very low level of overseas aid, about a quarter as much as some of the better countries, some of the European countries, a quarter as much on in proportion to the national income as a percentage of national income. I don't think we should be funding the arts, which mostly generally goes to, arts that are patronized by fairly wealthy people, subsidies for the opera or whatever it might be, while we are not providing decent health care for everyone in the community, and even more while we're among the real laggards in terms of how much we help people in extreme poverty.
And how popular does this make you with your humanities professors at Princeton?
Not always popular, but that's okay. I can wear that.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because you are asking a person who has already suffered, a blind person, to suffer more. But the alternative, you give you pay $50,000 for them to have a seeing eye dog, which could be transformative and improve their life so much. You're also you're asking hundreds of people over here to not see at all.
That's right. And they're likely to be there in low-income countries. They don't get the assistance that a person who can't see would get in the United States, even without a seeing eye dog. Maybe, perhaps their daughter has to look after them and therefore can't go out to work. So I think it's even tougher than it is to be unable to see in the United States.
Well, and I guess the really challenging part of your work, though, is that actually we're not choosing between those two things at all. People like you and me are choosing whether we want to get a new car or not.
Yeah, that's right. Or, upgrade our phone because there's a new iPhone out, although your phone is still doing really what you need it to do.
Yeah. Or, people are choosing to fly private because they don't want to sit with someone else on an airplane. Meanwhile, they could save thousands or tens of thousands of lives with the money they spend. And this isn't even getting into the environmental consequences of their decision as well.
Yes, certainly. That is another factor, and we should be thinking about those environmental consequences as well as about the money we could be saving.
So you got this famous award, right? I was talking about it in your bio that you won a $1 million philosophical prize, which you then donated to people in need. What does it feel like? Because I imagine it's a strange feeling that not too many people have, where someone gives you a very large amount of money, and there's probably this part of you that wants to think of it as yours, but you had, I guess the Stoics would say, both the justice and the discipline to not let it sit too long in your account, or not at all. What did that process actually feel like of taking this life-changing amount of money for you and directing it towards being truly life-changing for a large amount of people?
Yeah, well, I have to say it felt really good. I was really glad to get the opportunity to do that, to be able to help all of these. It was donated through Effective Charities, and the Life You Can Save has a list of independently assessed effective charities. So I was confident that the money was going to do what I was wanting it to do, to help people, to save the lives of children who would otherwise be vulnerable to malaria, or, as we were saying, to restore sight in people, or perhaps to provide mentoring and assistance so they could start a small business and work their way out of poverty, help women who were suffering from obstetric fistulas, which are life-ruining conditions, which can be surgically repaired for about $1,000. So, I was really pleased that there were a lot of different good things that I could do with this. And certainly from my position, obviously I'm a Princeton professor. I'm not on the poverty line. So from my position, what I would have done with that extra $1 million was really, putting a bit of icing on the cake. Maybe it wasn't going to make any huge difference to improvement in my life. So I was fortunate to be in that situation.
Yeah, I guess they say it's not a principle unless it costs you money. And then you got a large amount of money, and you had to test the principle.
It did cost me money, but it didn't cost me happiness, and that's surely more important than money, right? Money is an instrumental good for what you can do with it. And I think in terms of what it does in terms of increasing your happiness, it is really very high level of diminishing marginal utility. So yes, if you're on $30,000 or $40,000 a year and you get $1 million, it could make a big difference. But even then, you wouldn't need the whole million. You could probably get most of the difference it would make in your happiness. You would get for a couple of 100,000.
Yeah,
Right.
It's interesting. I don't want to get into some whole argument about whether money is real or not, the way that crypto people like to. But it is interesting that, like, it's not really real, right? Like, it's not like they gave you a briefcase of cash and then you had to go put that in the safe in your house, and then to spend it, it's like this all goes into a spreadsheet somewhere. And, someone is telling us that the number in the spreadsheet is getting larger or smaller. But it's all this kind of imaginary thing, especially after you reach a certain point, and you don't have, excessive spending habits. That number gets exponentially larger quite quickly, right? That's the power of compounding interest and all these things. And yet, taking it out of that spreadsheet makes it quite real, like very real to a large amount of people, as you did. But for some reason, I think we get stuck trying. I know I certainly do. So I'm not trying to judge other people, but it's like, well, it came in and I should put it here. And you have these systems. We're really good at building architecture in our lives or systems that make our net worth go higher. But we don't have the same system or prioritization of like making our net impact number go higher, or the net lives we've saved in the course of our life number going higher.
Yeah, that's right. And that's exactly what the organization I founded, The Life You Can Save, that grew out of the book, is trying to do. It's trying to change that culture so that people have the sense that, that's part of their life. Giving is part of their life. Helping people in greater need than they are is part of their life. It's a regular thing that they do. Maybe they make a regular recurring monthly donation is one good way to do it. And so they feel good about that, and they don't feel that it's a loss. And I've talked to people who grew up in families where they did that right from the start, and they just see that as part of their life. That they start out with what they've got in minus the whatever it might be, the 10% or something. Might be less if they're poorer, or more if they're wealthier. That's going out, and you can think of it also in a way of improving yourself as you go along. So just as if you're a runner, you might do a certain run every day or a few times a week, and you time yourself and you think, hey, that's great. I broke my personal best today. So you can do that with giving. Last year I gave X percentage. This year I'm going to give X plus Y%, and that'll be my personal best.
Sure. Yeah, there's a quote from Anne Frank that I loved, and I was reading more about it. I guess it was the motto of the Frank family, but it's no one ever became poor by giving, which I think is a beautiful way of expressing what we're talking about.
Exactly. I think that's quite right. Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to pick up, going back to what you just said before, is about if you don't have excessive spending habits, and that presumably fits with the Stoic view as well.
Sure.
It's really important that your spending is modest, that you keep it constrained, that you don't think I have to have, as we were just saying, whatever new thing comes out. Because if you live modestly, you can live a very satisfactory life, and it's then pretty easy to say, I don't need this. This is not something I really need to spend money on.
Yeah, there's a quote in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that I think about often. He says that the blessing of his life was that he never knew want, like he always had what he needed. And then anytime anyone ever asked him for something, he always had enough to give to them. So he was saying that he was rich not just because he didn't need anything, but he always had a surplus big enough that he could help people who did need something. And I thought that was a kind of a beautiful and concise definition of wealth.
That's a great definition of wealth, but is it applicable to a world in which everybody can email you, or and you're much more aware of the fact that there are people in need in countries far away from us? Of course, Marcus Aurelius ruled over a large Roman Empire, so but I guess people couldn't actually come to him and ask him for money in the way that they could now have emailed him.
Well, there is
Anyway.
kind of a magnificent scene in Marcus's life in the depths of the Antonine Plague. Rome's treasury is depleted, and he holds this sale on the lawn of the palace where he sells his wife's silken robes and their silver goblets and their furniture and their jewels. He just sells it all. The point being, in his view, was that he should suffer first before asking other people to suffer. I've always found that to be a kind of a beautiful embodiment of both leadership and what Stoicism is actually supposed to be about.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. I'm trying to, when I think back on my childhood, I don't remember many examples. My parents talked a lot about money, about saving money, about being smart with money, about working hard and all these things. But I just don't really remember much in the way of a practice of generosity or charitable giving. So that wasn't I feel like that wasn't a muscle. We went to church and I would see them put a little bit of money in the basket or whatever. But there wasn't much in the way of like that as a muscle. And I think that's one of the things I took from what you just said, is that this is something that's a little unnatural or a little, we're a little unpracticed in it. And it's actually something you have to try to get good at and try to push yourself to get better at, just in the way that you might have a fitness goal or a diet or a career goal. You should have sort of some charitable or impact goals also.
Yes, I think that's right. And, maybe the reason that we have to work at that is that, after all, we are descended from, millions of generations of beings who had to survive first, and they had to think of themselves to survive, and they had to think of if they were mammals anyway, they had to think of helping their children to survive. Sure. Otherwise, they wouldn't have passed on the genes.
Scarcity versus abundance.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And so I think we have inherited this idea of think about yourself first and think about your children, but we also have the capacity to see that we are just one among what's now 8 billion people in the world. And some of them, fortunately, a diminishing number of them, but, maybe 700-800 million of them are in extreme poverty, where they're living on what to us is like buying a cup of coffee somewhere, $2 a day. And yet for us, that's to spend $2 on something is just nothing. We don't even think about it. So that's the world we live in. And that's why we have to actually, I think, develop that sense of it is one world. As you were saying before, we can think about them and how they feel and how parents feel when their child would die, how we would feel if our child were to die. So that can help us to get in the habit and to make it something that feels perfectly natural to us to share some of our good fortune with them.
Do you think it also has something to do with sort of like who are our heroes? Like, who do we celebrate? Who do we hold up as, people that we want to be like? I was really surprised as I was reading the book. You have like a section or a chapter on Yannick Silver, who I happen to know pretty well. I've known for a long time. I always knew him as a successful business person. I've seen him at a bunch of conferences. We've had dinner a few times. Nice guy. I knew him to be a good parent and a friendly person, but I had no idea about his other sort of work on the side. His focus on effective altruism and his charitable work. And it just struck me as, one, how often we celebrate one kind of success in a person's life, and because they don't want to seem holier than thou, or they don't want to seem like they're doing it to get attention. Maybe we know less about the good they're doing on the side, but just that also so much of what we celebrate, like Forbes has their list of the richest people. They don't have a list of like the people who have helped the most people with their wealth.
Right. And yeah, that's what we need, an impact assessment of what people have done. And it's not just how much they've given, because the people who, we know are giving, and certainly this is true around Princeton, but many other places as well, are the people whose names are on buildings.
Yeah, sure.
And they've given, but they've given on condition that the money be used for a building, and then it gets named after them. And that may not be the best use even that Princeton could make of their money, right? But they're less likely to give that to scholarships for the needy because nobody sees their name on the scholarship in quite the same, in quite the same way. So that's one thing. But you're right. In a way, you said something like you don't want to appear self-righteous. In a way, we're too modest. Not the people who are giving for the buildings, but the rest of us are too modest, and we don't go public about what we're doing. So you know Yannick Silver, and yet you never knew the philanthropy that he was doing. So why is that? I think it's because he's inhibited about seeming to boast about it.
Yeah.
So he doesn't do that. Excuse me. But because he doesn't do that, other people don't think about giving that much. And there's plenty of good research in psychology that says if you know that other people are helping strangers, let's say, then you're more likely to help than if you think, oh, well, why should I help? Why am I the only one who's helping? There's other people around who are just as well off or better than me. And if you don't know that they're helping, you're less likely to help yourself.
Yeah, it's we not only don't encourage it, we even have like a slur that we throw at it. We call it virtue signaling, right? Like we not only don't celebrate the good stuff that people are doing, but that we criticize them if they dare to talk about it too much or if they're not modest enough about what they've done.
Right. So virtue signaling is the current sort of trendy term that comes out of evolutionary theory.
Yeah.
But otherwise we call them do-gooders, right? And that also has a bit of a pejorative sense to it, to be a do-gooder. I don't know if you know the book by Larissa McFarquhar called Strangers Drowning.
No.
It's a fascinating book because it has different chapters on different do-gooders who are really, truly admirable. Some of them are giving money. Some of them might be giving a kidney. Some of them are taking in kids who are in need, abandoned kids, disabled kids, and so on. And she mingles that. It's not just the stories, but she mingles it with some sort of philosophical discussion about altruism, about how much people can do under the circumstances in which altruism arises. And it's a really interesting study which shows the possibilities for some of us that what people can do. And I found it really inspiring as well as intellectually stimulating.
Well, it's funny, right? Like buying the Ferrari is visible, right? You can see that they bought the Ferrari, and that's either impressive or whatever it means to you. But by definition, not buying the Ferrari is not visible. And sending the money overseas or to this charity or anonymously donating here or what is again by definition not visible. And so we kind of have this this conflict in which not doing good is inherently more visible, inherently more rewarded than doing good. And so there's this sort of disparity in terms of credit. And then what do we signal to people is important? Like we signal having a nice car is important because people have nice cars and we see it and it says something about them. And the other thing, by not having the signal, we don't know about, and so we have no sense of how important it is or how prevalent it is. Yeah.
An even more glaring example than the nice cars, I find, is the really expensive watches, the Rolexes or Breitlings or whatever it might be, which don't do any better than this Casio. In fact, they're worse really in terms of keeping time, or you have to wind them or something like that, or they don't have the multiple functions. But people pay $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 for one of those watches, and it does nothing except say, I'm really wealthy because otherwise I couldn't have afforded this watch.
Yeah, that's a good point. Oh man, it's tough. And then where do you draw the line? Do you need the Casio watch at all? I have an Apple Watch. It's certainly more expensive than your watch, but I tell myself, hey, it's not a Rolex, and
right.
All of a sudden, you get down to, well, why don't you just look at the sun and guess, Yeah,
you could do that, but not at night, maybe.
Yes, sure.
You can use your phone, I suppose, but that's a bit less convenient. carry a watch, and maybe having an Apple Watch has some functionality for you that saves you time doing some things. That's fine. But actually, I got given a Breitling recently for a talk that I did in Switzerland. Instead of getting paid for it, they gave me a Breitling. If any of your listeners would like a Breitling and is prepared to donate, I think mine is around $6,000. Is prepared to donate $6,000 to charity. It's unused, unworn. I'd like them to just send me an email, and it's theirs.
You should have an auction for it.
Well, that would be an idea. Maybe that's what we should be doing. I'll talk to people at the Life You Can Save. Maybe we'll do that. You
should wear it precisely once, so then it could be Peter Singer's Breitling, and then it's now worth $50,000 because it has this story behind it, and now you've helped even more people. But by attaching a story to it and a narrative and a cause to it, you took something that could have provided $6,000 in value, and now you've got $50,000 in value.
Okay, right. I'm going to take back what I just said. Yeah, you need to donate $50,000 to an effective charity, and it's yours.
There you go. There you go. That's a beautiful idea. I do think about that. Like, how do you, when you are good at something, you command, in the system that we have, you command a price that the market sets. And obviously you don't want to accept less than what the market accepts, because that only helps the multi-billion-dollar publisher that would have paid you X and instead is paying you 3X. But just because they are paying you that doesn't mean you're actually worth that or you need that. And so reading your work, and as I've been writing this book about justice, I am trying to think more and more about how does one, sort of pay it forward or effectively use the surplus that their skills or unique set of circumstances has created for them. Because again, just putting it in a spreadsheet and congratulating yourself that it's a large number at the end of your life is not particularly meaningful.
No, it's not. So I face this when I get invited to give talks, sometimes talks for corporations, sometimes talks for universities or other institutions. And I don't need the money, but I don't want to do it for free. So, yes. And also I would, I get more invitations than I could possibly accept. So I ask for a donation to one of the Life You Can Save's recommended charities. And depending on how much time is involved, how much travel, what the institution is, I'll vary that amount. But I take that as the sign of recognition that they want me enough that they're prepared to make a sizable donation. Plus, it's doing some good. I find that I guess I could just charge the fee and then donate it myself, but I'm happy to do it either way.
Well, I sometimes think about that. My books have been popular with the armed forces, and so I'll often get requests, and I go, well, these are soldiers, you're speaking to them. I think they do important work and blah, blah, blah. And then I go, 50% of the U.S. budget goes to the Defense Department. I don't want to keep it in there. And you know what I mean? First off, it's my taxpayer dollars that I'm just getting back in some form or another. But yeah, I think sometimes people who have this sense of money's not important to me, I want to do good in the world, they feel guilty making money or asking for what they are worth. And I do think effective altruism has been clever and innovative in this idea of earning to give, or thinking about how, you just not accepting money for your services doesn't really help anyone. But if you can leverage those services to do good for other people, then I think you found a way to solve that problem.
I think that's right. Yes, and recognizing that money can do good for others, that it's fungible in that way, is the first step towards thinking, yeah, sure, I don't have to feel bad that I'm asking for money for this. If I'm asking for it, as you say, from the U.S. military or from corporations or institutions that can afford it and that would normally expect to pay that for a speaker, let's say. But let's do something more positive with it than just use it to enrich myself, in which case I would feel bad about asking some of those sums.
What about, is there an ethical line? Like, let's say some foreign government of ill repute wanted to pay you to give a talk. Now, ostensibly, you could get that money and it's better for you to have it than them to have it, and then you could use it to do good. But would you draw a line there? Like, can one take take money unethically to then use ethically, or how do you think about that?
Well, I think it does depend on what the effect of taking it will be. Is the foreign government, or this could also be a corporation, for example.
Yes.
This has been debated about tobacco corporations. Are they using it to improve their image so that people will think this is fine? We don't need to regulate tobacco. We don't need to put big warnings on cigarette packs, and they're okay. In that case, maybe you shouldn't be taking that money or allowing your name to be used for them. But if they're not doing that, and particularly, let's say, if it's a foreign government and you can say what you want about it, and that's made clear, then maybe you can actually do good within that country as well as using the money for some good. So it's going to depend on the particular situation that you're in.
Yeah, have you seen this new golf league that the Saudis have funded?
Yes, I've heard about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you take $100 million guaranteed payment, but then you use it for good, is that the same as, just taking the money because they're paying you so much more than the PGA Tour? Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one. Does it make any difference to what the Saudis do or to their position in the world that they're sponsoring this golf? I think probably not really. People know what they've done. They know about the Khashoggi murder, and they know that they haven't been very helpful right now in the context of the Ukraine war and the energy shortage in terms of keeping prices down a little bit. So I think they know that anyway. And if I were a good enough golfer to be offered $100 million for playing with the Saudi Golf League, I'd probably take it, because that would be a lot of good that I could do with that money.
Yeah, it's tricky, and to go to your donation, it's easy for regular people to sit around and going, you should never do it, or you should do it and donate it. But that's because you're not looking at a large number with a lot of zeros after it being dangled in front of you. It gets tricky once it's your money, or potentially your money.
Yeah, I mean, it can get trickier, but if you've decided before you went into it that you were going to give this money, and maybe you say that publicly so that people know that you're doing that, and it makes it harder for you to back down without getting embarrassed, you can do that.
Yeah, I guess that's why these pledges are so effective, and some of these labels can be so effective, is that they keep us honest, or they force us to give, as you say in the book, past the point where it hurts a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. I think public pledges and saying things about your giving in public, it certainly should help.
Well, I thought the book was fascinating, and it certainly changed how I think about a lot of things. And I really appreciate what you do. And I think this is what philosophy is supposed to do, which is it's supposed to challenge us, and it's supposed to make us better people, not just involve a bunch of unpronounceable names and impossible to solve proofs or problems.
Yeah, I think it's important to get people to realize that philosophy is relevant to anybody's everyday life. The humanities are not in such great shape in all areas. They have to compete with the STEM subjects. And, there are some things that go on in some of the humanities that I don't think are particularly worthwhile, but I think philosophy really is something special. I've seen this throughout my career, that students have changed their lives because of classes that they've taken with me, or people have reading things that they've read that have changed their lives in philosophy. So I think it's got to be there. It's a society in which people didn't think deeply about how they ought to live would be really an impoverished society.
No, that's right, and I think that's why we've been struggling with these questions for so long. Is that they're really hard and really vexing, but as we get a little bit closer, hopefully we get a little bit better each time, each generation.
Hopefully we do. Yep.
Well, thank you very, very much. All right, let me hit stop here, and we'll make sure this gets uploaded.